The chamber was silent in that heavy, suffocating way where every cough, every shuffle of paper felt like a shout. All eyes were fixed on the long mahogany bench where the Chief Justice himself sat, his black robe folding neatly, his expression tight. And then, in the middle of Jasmine Crockett's pointed, unwavering words, it happened. A smirk, a curl of lips, and finally, dash laughter. It wasn't a laugh of joy. It wasn't even a laugh of irony. It was the cold, clipped chuckle of a man who believed his power was untouchable, his authority unquestioned. John Roberts let it slip, and the sound echoed through the chamber like a slap. For a moment you could see it, the startled looks, the tightened jaws, the faint gasp of disbelief. A Chief Justice, laughing down at a woman daring to speak truth. Cameras didn't miss it. The microphones caught it clean. Across living rooms and cell phone screens, Americans leaned closer, replaying the sound again and again. And with each replay, outrage bloomed. Because this wasn't just about one woman being dismissed. It was about a system, centuries old, reducing her words to a punchline. Jasmine Crockett didn't flinch. That was the part that stung most. Her shoulders stayed square, her gaze steady, her voice unbroken. But inside the chamber, the atmosphere had shifted. You could feel the tension coil tight as wire, as if the entire room knew what was coming, but couldn't yet name it. The nation watched, hearts pounding, as the highest judge in the land mocked a woman fighting not for ego, not for theatrics, but for justice. It was the kind of moment designed to humiliate, to remind her of the hierarchy who held the gavel, and who was expected to bow beneath it. But Jasmine Crockett was not the kind to bow. The laughter faded, swallowed by the walls of history surrounding them. For a second, Roberts looked certain he had punctured her authority, that the gallery would remember only the smirk, the chuckle, the subtle cruelty. Yet as Crockett drew in a slow breath, her eyes never leaving his, the air shifted once more. This wasn't just another hearing. It wasn't a procedural shuffle through papers or a dry exchange of legal jargon. This was a moment that cut to the heart of what America claims to stand for: accountability, democracy, justice. The kind of moment when the decisions made inside those marble walls ripple far beyond Washington into communities, households, and futures that depend on the law being more than a game of power, and at the center of it sat the power imbalance. Made flesh. John Roberts, the embodiment of establishment authority, cloaked in the black robe of final judgment. His voice, his smile, his silence, all carried the weight of centuries of hierarchy. He didn't need to shout to command the room. He was the room. The institution lived in his posture, in his carefully measured words. And on this die, in the mocking curve of his smirk, across from him stood Jasmine Crockett, not cloaked in tradition, but armed with truth. No robe, no lifetime appointment, no centuries of deference behind her, just her voice, her conviction. The underdog truth-teller, standing before the highest judge in the land. That laugh, sharp, dismissive, cutting through the chamber like glass, wasn't just aimed at Crockett. It was aimed at every voice that ever dared to speak against power. It was the sound of the gatekeeper saying, "Your words don't matter. Your fight doesn't matter. You don't matter." And in that instant, the stakes became clear. This wasn't about one woman versus one man. It was about the battle between dignity and arrogance, between the lived experience of millions and the insulated authority of the few. It was about whether truth had a place in halls that often prefer silence. The tension thickened like storm clouds before lightning. Journalists leaned forward. Clerks froze in place. Even those in the chamber who disagreed with Crockett couldn't ignore the weight of what had just happened. A Chief Justice had laughed. On record. On camera. And Jasmine Crockett had not blinked. For the millions watching at home, the message landed like a gut punch, because they knew that laugh. They had heard it in boardrooms, classrooms, courtrooms, anywhere power believed it could belittle dissent. That laugh carried the memory of every time someone had been dismissed for being young, for being a woman, for being black, for daring to be outspoken. The The chamber itself seemed to hold its breath. Roberts leaned back, perhaps expecting Crockett to falter, to retreat, to let the moment pass as so many had before. But she didn't, and in that refusal, the entire balance of power began to quiver. Because this wasn't going to end as a soundbite or a fleeting headline. This was about to become something larger, something unforgettable. No one in the chamber expected what came next. They thought the laugh would linger, that Crockett's words would fade, that the story would remain confined to the marble walls. But they were wrong, because what was about to unfold would not stay in Washington. It would race across screens, ignite conversations, stir outrage, and plant hope. It would prove that truth, when spoken with courage, has a force that even the loudest laugh cannot silence. For most Americans, the name John Roberts has always carried an air of distance, cold, polished, untouchable. To some, he is the image of the careful jurist, deliberate in tone, cautious with words, robed in the dignity of neutrality. The man who, at least on the surface, embodied the idea that justice was blind. His every appearance in public reinforced that image, calm, steady, immune to the tempests of partisan fury. If the court was the temple of law, then Roberts was its high priest, carefully guarding the illusion that fairness and order reigns supreme. But illusions crack, and when they do, the truth beneath them can be far more dangerous. Because behind the curated persona of impartiality lived a man who understood his power, lished it even, wielded it not always to uplift, but to belittle. His smile, subtle though it often was, had been enough to unnerve senators, lawyers, and even presidents who found themselves on the receiving end. Roberts didn't shout or rage. He didn't need to. He dismissed. With a lift of the brow, with a clipped phrase, with that smirk that suggested not just disagreement, but disdain, was the authority of someone who knew he would never face a true consequence. And that was the paradox. The man entrusted to represent blind justice, to ensure fairness without fear or favor, had on that day revealed something far less noble: arrogance. The arrogance not of one hearing, but of years, spent unchallenged at the pinnacle of power. The contradictions were hard to miss once the mask slipped. Here was a judge who preached restraint, but showed indulgence when it came to mocking a woman's attempt to hold truth before power. Here was a man lauded as an institutionalist, yet using the weight of the institution to crush dissent with nothing more than a laugh. He claimed the mantle of impartiality, but impartiality does not sneer. Impartiality does not humiliate. Impartiality does not smirk in the face of courage. And yet Roberts had. That single moment of laughter spoke louder than decades of carefully polished press clippings. It revealed a villain not in the melodramatic sense, but in the way that resonates most deeply with lived experience, not the cartoon tyrant pounding fists and barking orders, but the quiet overseer who believes his position gives him license to belittle those beneath him. The archetype of the gatekeeper who guards the halls of power, not by defending justice, but by mocking those who dare to enter without his permission. It was precisely this type of villainies, mug, unrepentant, confident in its invincibility, that progressive audiences recognized immediately, because they had seen it before. In every official who laughed off protests, every executive who smirked at calls for accountability, every authority figure who believed their role gave them superiority rather than responsibility. Roberts, in that moment, became more than himself. He became a symbol of every establishment figure who uses power not to serve, but to silence. And that is why so few dared to challenge him directly. Because Roberts wasn't just a man, he was an institution. To take him on was to risk political exile, to be painted as reckless, disrespectful, or out of line. Senators measured their words. Lawyers calculated their tone. Journalists skirted the edges, careful not to earn his permanent disfavor. His reputation had long shielded him from direct confrontation, turning him into the kind of figure who could laugh openly, confident that no one would push back. But institutions rot when left unchallenged, and in the silence that had long surrounded him, his arrogance had grown unchecked. He had become not the guardian of balance, but the embodiment of imbalance. Untouchable, smug, secure in the knowledge that the marble and tradition around him would always protect him, until Jasmine Crockett. Her presence in that hearing was not supposed to alter the script. She was expected to play her part, the underdog voice, passionate but ultimately contained within the boundaries that Roberts himself had drawn. But villains always underestimate those they mock, and Roberts, with his dismissive laugh, underestimated her most of all. That underestimation was the seed of suspense, because rarely, almost never, had anyone in that chamber dared to look Roberts in the eye and refuse to shrink, to refuse to be silenced by the weight of his authority. The room, the nation, the world understood what was at stake. When Crockett held her ground, the villain had revealed himself. The mask of impartial justice had slipped, replaced by the arrogance of unchecked power. And the question now hung heavy in the chamber, electrifying every breath. Jasmine Crockett never walked into power through gilded doors or marble halls. She came from the places America often tries to forget, neighborhoods where opportunity was scarce, where the deck always seemed stacked, and where voices like hers were told to stay quiet. But Crockett never believed silence was survival. Even as a child, she learned that speaking truth, even when your voice shook, was the only way forward. Her upbringing was not the kind that polished you with privilege. It sharpened you with struggle. The daughter of working-class parents, she watched her family hustle through long shifts and late nights just to keep the lights on. She saw what it meant to be dismissed not because of a lack of merit, but because of a last name, a zip code, or the color of her skin. Those early lessons didn't embitter her. They forged in her a relentless clarity about justice. When she studied law, she wasn't the student aiming for cocktail parties or elite clerkships. She was the one poring over cases about eviction, police overreach, and civil rights violations. In cramped libraries surrounded by towering stacks of casebooks, Crockett made herself a promise. She would never let the law remain a weapon only for the powerful. For her, the law had to be a shield for the vulnerable. She cut her teeth not in high-profile courtrooms, but in small-town hearings where the stakes were still life-changing for those she defended. She represented the tenant facing eviction, the young man profiled by police, the single mother fighting to keep custody of her children. Every case was personal. Every win was a battle against a system tilted away from people like her clients and like her. But Crockett wasn't just a lawyer. She was an organizer, an advocate, a voice that grew louder as others tried to quiet it. She understood something many politicians never grasp, that people don't want saviors, they want fighters who've bled the same battles. When she entered politics, she carried the same fire she brought into court, calling out corruption, demanding accountability, and refusing to bow to the performative etiquette of the establishment. Her colleagues in Congress quickly realized she wasn't afraid to go where others wouldn't. She didn't trade her voice for committee assignments or curry favor with powerful insiders. Instead, she chose to represent the unheard, the immigrants who worked double shifts, the communities left behind by broken promises, the young people who refused to accept injustice as permanent. To some, that made her too fiery. To her supporters, it made her authentic. And yet, for all her intensity, Crockett carried a calm rooted in experience. She had seen humiliation before, judges rolling their eyes, colleagues dismissing her arguments, media pundits underestimating her. But what others misread as weakness was her quiet preparation. Each slight only deepened her resolve. Each laugh at her expense became fuel by the time she entered the chamber where John Roberts sat. She wasn't just another representative. She was a culmination of decades of resilience, an attorney who had stood shoulder to shoulder with the voiceless, a legislator who refused to conform, a woman who knew the cost of dignity because she had paid it herself. And then came the moment. Roberts laughed. It wasn't a simple chuckle. It was the kind of laugh that carried centuries of dismissal, the kind of smirk that echoed the establishment's favorite tactic: belittle those who dare to challenge power. The chamber heard it. The cameras caught it. Millions would soon replay it, but Crockett didn't flinch. She didn't meet arrogance with outrage, nor laughter with noise. because this exact moment was the arena she had been preparing for her whole life. Every courtroom dismissal, every uphill battle, every fight for a client who had no one else, all of it had been training for this stage. John Roberts thought he was putting her in her place, but what he didn't realize was that Jasmine Crockett had no interest in playing by the places defined for her. Her life had been a rebellion against small boxes and lowered ceilings. She didn't rise to this chamber by accident. She rose because she knew exactly what it meant to be underestimated, exactly how to turn that underestimation into victory. And when John Roberts laughed at her, what seemed like a moment of humiliation was actually the ignition of a storm. Because Jasmine Crockett had been waiting not for permission, not for validation, but for the moment where truth could be spoken so clearly that even the most powerful man in the chamber would have no answer. The nation would soon realize. His laughter was the last sound of arrogance before the silence of defeat. But first, Crockett had to deliver it. And when she opened her mouth, the entire balance of the hearing and, perhaps the country, was about to shift. The chamber was thick with tension long before the laugh. John Roberts leaned back in his chair, his robe draping like a shield of authority, his eyes sharp but disinterested, as if this entire proceeding were beneath him. Each time he spoke, the words carried a quiet sting. Questions framed not to seek answers, but to remind Jasmine Crockett of her place. "Congresswoman," he began, voice heavy with patronizing cadence. "Perhaps your confusing passion. With precedent, do you even understand the constitutional framework you're invoking here?" The question wasn't a genuine inquiry. It was a trap, a dismissal cloaked in legal jargon. Around the room, a few aides exchanged glances, knowing the subtext. Roberts wasn't seeking clarity. He was drawing lines, boxing Crockett into the corner where countless challengers had been forced before, but Crockett didn't flinch. She met his gaze steadily, her voice even, her words measured. "Chief Justice, I understand the Constitution, not as an artifact to protect the powerful, but as a living document that safeguards the people. That's the framework I stand on." Her tone was calm, almost disarming in its steadiness. But Roberts pressed harder. He shifted forward, smirk, tugging at the edge of his mouth. "Safeguards are one thing, Congresswoman. Interpretation is another. Surely you're not suggesting your experience rivals that of this court?" It was a subtle jab, dressed as a polite query. The imbalance was obvious. The most powerful jurist in the nation, wielding institutional gravitas like a weapon, against a woman who dared to speak truth with no shield but her conviction. The tension built with each exchange. Crockett's responses refused to bend under his weight. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't let anger seep through. Instead, she let silence stretch between her words, forcing the chamber to feel her composure. Every second of restraint made Roberts bristle more. He thrived on dominance, on his words silencing the opposition. Crockett's refusal to crumble only magnified his restlessness. Observers in the room leaned forward in their seats, sensing the inevitable. Something was about to snap. Roberts finally let irritation slip into his voice. "Congresswoman, let me remind you, this is not a forum for theatrics. This is a court of law." Her reply was razor-sharp, yet steady. "Then let us both honor it with truth, not dismissal." The words landed like a stone dropped in still water. A few gasps echoed faintly. Robert's jaw tightened. The back and forth had turned into something more than an exchange. It was a duel of philosophies, authority versus accountability, arrogance versus dignity. And just as the energy in the room hit its breaking point, Roberts leaned back again, eyes narrowing, and let out that fateful laugh, dismissive, sharp, echoing through the chamber with a sting no words could match. The sound cut through the silence like a gavel slamming down, but not in justice. In mockery, and that laugh, small as it seemed, shifted everything. No one in the chamber expected what came next, but millions, soon enough, would be talking about it. The laugh hung in the chamber, sharp and hollow, echoing longer than Roberts could have intended. It was supposed to be a dismissal, the kind of scoff that had silenced countless critics, attorneys, and even senators before. But this time, the sound didn't settle as dominance. It rippled through the room like a spark hitting dry tinder, igniting something larger than he could control. Jasmine Crockett didn't flinch. She didn't scowl. She didn't retreat into silence like so many before her. Instead, she stood taller, folding the laughter into her posture as if it were fueled. Her voice, calm but edged with steel, broke the tension. "Chief Justice," she said evenly, "you can laugh if you'd like. History is full of men who laughed at women who dared to. Speak with conviction." The chamber shifted. Heads turned. A murmur rose and quickly died, people leaning in, sensing something different was unfolding. She let the silence breathe, a deliberate pause. Then her words cut clean through the air. They laughed at Shirley Chisholm when she ran for president. They laughed at Barbara Jordan when she spoke truth to power during Watergate. They even laughed at Thurgood Marshall when he argued that segregation was unconstitutional. But history remembers their courage, not the laughter. Gasps rippled across the rows. Some aides exchanged wide-eyed glances. Roberts, still seated, adjusted in his chair, his smirk faltering just slightly. Crockett continued, her cadence gathering force like a prosecutor cross-examining a witness. And yet, here we are again, a woman raising inconvenient truths, met not with reasoned argument, but with ridicule. Is that the justice our people deserve? Is that the impartiality your robe represents? The room went still. Robert's eyes narrowed, but his silence spoke volumes. His weapon mockery had been turned against him. She pressed forward, refusing to give him space to recover. "When you laugh, Chief Justice, you're not laughing at me. You're laughing at every working mother who's ever been told her voice doesn't matter. You're laughing at every young law student of color who studies late at night, only to be dismissed in daylight. You're laughing at the very citizens this court was created to serve." Her words carried weight, each one dropping heavier than the last. For a moment, Roberts looked less like the untouchable arbiter of justice, and more like a man caught in the glare of accountability. Crockett's tone shifted softer, but sharper, like a blade sliding effortlessly through cloth, you ask. "If I understand the Constitution, I do, and I understand that its framers wrote it to be tested, challenged, and improved by each generation. To suggest otherwise is to fossilize it, to make it a monument to arrogance rather than a covenant of freedom." Another pause. The silence this time was deafening. Then she leaned forward, her voice low but ringing with undeniable certainty. "So, yes, you can laugh, Chief Justice, but know this. History has never bowed to laughter. It bows to justice." The chamber erupted in hushed murmurs. Some gasps, some nods, even a few faint claps, before decorum snapped them back. "Out." Roberts shifted. Again, his once dominant presence dimming beneath the gravity of her words, and Crockett wasn't done. Her rhythm rose like a closing argument, each phrase a hammer striking at the brittle shell of authority. "You sit in the highest court of the land, a symbol meant to remind us all that power must serve principle, not ego. But what principle is served when the most powerful man in the room mocks rather than listens? What precedent does that set?" Roberts blinked, his smirk gone, his jaw tight. The reversal was clear. The robe that had cloaked him in untouchability now looked almost heavy, as though it were burden instead of armor. Crockett let the silence hang again, then delivered the blow that left the room stunned. "Chief Justice, dignity is not something you can demand from this chamber. It's something you either embody or forfeit. And in this moment, with that laugh, you forfeited it." The line landed like a gavel. The silence that followed was thick, reverent. Roberts, for once, had no words, his authority so absolute. Just minutes earlier had been punctured, his laughter transformed into a symbol of arrogance, defeated by dignity. Crockett stepped back slightly, her posture calm, her expression composed. No theatrics, no raised voice, no flourish. Just quiet certainty, the kind that left its mark deeper than any shout could. Observers in the chamber knew they had just witnessed something rare. A power shift in real time. A woman, once positioned as the subject of ridicule, had turned. Ridicule into revelation, and in the annals of political clashes, that moment would not be remembered for Roberts. Like laughter. it would be remembered for Crockett's mic drop. Her final words lingered. Impossible to dismiss. History is not kind. To arrogance, Chief Justice. But it never forgets courage. The chamber sat in silence, her words echoing long after they'd been spoken. And in that silence, everyone knew Roberts had laughed first. But Jasmine Crockett had the last word. The final. Echo of Crockett's words lingered in the chamber like a thunderclap. For a moment, no one moved. The stillness was deafening, broken only by the faint hum of cameras zooming closer, desperate to capture the frozen expressions on every face. Senators shifted in their chairs, their usual political bravado stripped away. Even Roberts, the man who had wielded authority like a weapon, sat motionless, his smirk gone, his gavel idle. Then came the ripple. Quiet murmur spread through the rows of aides and reporters, like the first tremor before an earthquake. Eyes widened, heads tilted, and whispers turned into astonished gasps. In the press section, journalists clutched their laptops with frantic urgency. They knew they had just witnessed something rare, something that would ripple beyond the marble walls of the chamber. Within minutes, the world outside erupted. Phones buzzed across the country as live stream clips began to spread like wildfire. On Twitter, the first hashtag appeared, hashtag Crockett clapback. Then another, hashtag truth over arrogance. Each refresh revealed thousands more retweets, captions dripping with admiration, disbelief, or both. The viral machinery of the internet had found its fuel, and it burned fast. Commentators went live before the hearing had even adjourned. Progressive. Anchors leaned forward in their chairs, voices rising with barely contained glee. You just saw history in the making, one declared. This wasn't a soundbite, it was a reckoning. On TikTok, teens stitched the clip with dramatic music, turning Crockett's words into memes that spread her defiance across generational divides. On Instagram, the freeze frame of Robert's stunned face circulated, like an emblem of poetic justice. But the reaction wasn't confined to digital applause. In living rooms, barbershops, college campuses, and community centers, people leaned closer to their screens, some cheering, others wiping away tears. For immigrant families, for women who had been laughed at in boardrooms, for every worker who had been told their voice didn't matter, Crockett's stance resonated like a personal victory. It wasn't just that she had held her ground, it was that she had done it with grace, intelligence, and fire all at once. Meanwhile, the establishment reeled. Conservative pundits scrambled to reframe the narrative, insisting Robert's laughter was harmless, a mere chuckle misinterpreted by an oversensitive left. But their talking points sounded brittle, hollow, and defensive. Against the raw footage, there was no spinning the power of what people had seen. A woman standing tall, while the Chief Justice shrank in real time. Even within the political class, shockwaves spread. Law clerks whispered that Roberts had been unusually quiet in his chambers. Colleagues who once feared crossing him suddenly spoke of his misstep. And behind closed doors, party strategists admitted what they rarely said aloud. Crockett had just shifted the balance of perception. For Crockett herself, the aftermath was surreal. Her staff's phones buzzed nonstop with interview requests, congratulatory messages, and even threats. Supporters flooded her campaign website with small-dollar donations, leaving notes that read, "You gave us a voice tonight." The chamber, where she had once felt the weight of condescension, now seemed lighter, charged not with intimidation, but with possibility. And yet beneath the noise, a deeper truth emerged. This clash wasn't just about Crockett versus Roberts, or even about a single exchange. It symbolized something larger, the timeless battle between arrogance and dignity, between power that mocks and courage that refuses to bend. The viral moment was proof that in a system too often tilted toward the elite, a single act of moral clarity could tilt it back, even if only for a heartbeat. Still, as the headlines rolled in and the hashtags climbed higher, a lingering question hovered in the air. What did this moment really mean for America? Is it just another viral clash destined to fade in tomorrow's cycle of outrage? Or was it the spark of a deeper awakening? Because as electrifying as Crockett's triumph had been, Its true meaning would only be revealed in the days to come. But the true meaning of this clash, the commentators whispered, went far beyond one courtroom exchange. When the dust settled and the headlines began to blur into one another, Crockett was asked again and again how it felt to humiliate the Chief Justice in front of the nation. Each time, she shook her head with the same calm poise she had carried in that chamber. It was never about humiliating anyone, she said softly, her voice measured. It was about truth. It was about refusing to let mockery drown out dignity. And with those words, she reframed the entire event. What millions had seen as a verbal knockout punch, Crockett insisted on redefining as something more profound. A reminder that courage isn't about volume, arrogance, or spectacle. It's about clarity. It's about standing rooted in principle. Even when the ground beneath you shakes, that was the lesson that began to crystallize as the viral clips spread across continents. Viewers who had first watched for the drama started watching again for the substance. They replayed her tone, her restraint, the way she paused just long enough to let Robert's laugh collapse under its own weight. This wasn't a battle of egos. It was a case study in how dignity can outshine derision. Because arrogance, by its nature, is loud. It sneers. It mocks. It tries to diminish others. But dignity? Dignity doesn't need to shout. It stands tall in silence, and when it speaks, its words carry the weight of truth. Crockett had proven that. She hadn't matched Robert's laugh with anger, hadn't traded sarcasm for sarcasm. She had met his mockery with calm courage and, in doing so, she revealed a universal law. When arrogance tries to belittle, it is ultimately belittled by its own emptiness. When dignity responds, the world listens, and so the moment took on a life of its own. It's no longer just a political skirmish, but a parable of leadership. Students discussed it in classrooms. Clergy referenced it in sermons. Even corporate trainers pointed to it as an example of poise under pressure. The message resonated everywhere. Leadership is not intimidation. It is integrity. The emotional crescendo came from Crockett herself when she later addressed a gathering in her hometown. Standing on a modest stage, surrounded by faces that had known her long before cameras did, she let her voice rise just slightly. Filled with conviction. This wasn't just a rebuttal. It was proof that truth can silence even the loudest laugh. The crowd erupted, not because of the words alone, but because of the conviction behind them. Everyone in that room had, in some form, felt the sting of being dismissed, laughed at, underestimated. Crockett had given that pain a voice, and more importantly, had given it an answer. In the end, this wasn't about Crockett versus Roberts. It wasn't about Democrats versus Republicans, progressives versus conservatives, or even citizen versus judge. It was about something bigger, something timeless. It was about the eternal struggle between those who use power to mock, those who use courage to stand. History has always favored the latter. Kings who mocked their people fell. Generals who sneered at their enemies were undone. Leaders who relied on arrogance faded into obscurity. But those who led with integrity, who carried themselves with quiet strength, are remembered long after the noise has died. Crockett's exchange reminded the nation of that truth. And in an era where politics so often feels like theater, where laughter is used as a weapon and intimidation passes for strength, her stand offered a glimpse of what leadership should be, not domination, not humiliation, but integrity, clarity, and courage. And so as the nation debated, memed, and dissected that single exchange, the real legacy of the moment came into focus. The clash had given people a spectacle, yes, but more importantly, it had given them a reminder that dignity is not weakness. Calm courage can cut deeper than mockery ever could. The courtroom fell silent that day. But the lesson continues to echo, and so we return to the moment that started it all. The laugh, the silence, the rebuttal. The headlines captured it one way. Crockett shuts down Roberts. But the deeper truth is this: Crockett didn't flip the trial with rage. She flipped it with truth. She showed the nation that when arrogance tries to belittle, dignity can rise and disarm it completely. That is the moral clarity we must carry forward. Because America today doesn't need louder voices or sharper insults, doesn't need leaders who hide behind laughter or intimidation. It needs leaders with courage. Leaders with dignity. Leaders who understand that power is not about mocking others, it's about lifting others. Crockett's stand reminds us that integrity is not weakness, it is strength. That calm courage can silence arrogance more effectively than anger ever could, and that truth spoken with conviction always outlasts the sneer of mockery. Now the question is, what will we do with that lesson? Will we let it fade as just another viral clip, or will we take it as a call to demand more from those who claim to lead us? Because this story isn't just about one exchange in one chamber, it's about all of us. It's about the kind of nation we choose to build. So if you believe in standing up to arrogance with dignity, if you believe that integrity should guide leadership, not intimidation, then make your voice heard, subscribe,